physiology course. And they really let you do things in those days. I and another guy had a dog. We removed the skull cap. We did all the operation, exposed the brain, and I can remember saying, you know, I would really like to do this with human beings. Literally. I said, this is the master mystery, the brain. And I thought about it, and I said, you know, I really considered going to medical school, doing neurosurgery, etc. And I said, I'm married, I had one kid, and I said, I can't do it. I got 4 years in the Air Force, I've got to get a career, earn a living. And so there was a cut point. I still remember crystal clear, that I didn't do. And that's an alternate career I could have gone into, and I know I would have loved it. I would have loved it. And I read all the fMRI literature. I keep on top of it. I mean, so you can see it, you know. But I still look at the IO literature too. I can't focus.
Tom, what are you proudest of in your career?
Oh, I'm proudest of working with students like you, and Matt McHugh was one of my students. Wendy's going to be one of my students. I think teaching people how to do it right, do it rigorously, and ask interesting questions. I think, like I said, you know, social psychology, just for some reason or other, most of it is trivia. And a lot of psychology is trivia. And there's a certain arrogance when you say that, because, you know, certain things do turn out to be very important later on, and you hadn't thought about it. So, but how to get people focused on real interesting problems is Paul Meehl used to have a statement. We bring in people for consideration for positions, and he says, they got to turn you on intellectually. They got to convince you they're doing something really interesting. They've got a real handle on it. They understand it, and they're going to learn something. You know, and you got to get that kind of a focus. And that biases me just terribly. I think that's how I feel about it.
Yeah. How does you've integrated evolutionary concepts into your work?
I teach evolutionary psychology
from time to time.
Actually, that's an interesting story. You want to hear that one? My colleague, Nancy Siegel, had a very strong interest in evolution. And she got it because she got her degree from Danny Friedman at the University of Chicago. It was an early, very early evolution. He was doing it when it was just absolutely controversial and completely unacceptable. Of course, I like unacceptable things. That's why I went to jail in the free speech movement. You know, if it gets people aggravated, they must be interested and they must think it's important. So that's a kind of a key indicator. But she kept saying, you know, you got to read this. You got to look at this. Nancy, I barely keep my head above water, etc. So but she'd give me a paper and she'd say, well, you know, we should think about it this way. And finally, I said, you know, I sort of gave in. I started to read it, and I said, hey, I really like this stuff. Now, that's, again, the seeds go way back. There don't seem to be any doubt about that. So maybe there are environmental influences, but I can remember in taking sophomore biology in high school. I mean, I remember dissecting a pig, taking every piece and every muscle and all that. And I remember that being one of the, I guess I like to cut things up, don't I? Think about that. But I remember just absolutely loving that course. That was one of the best courses I ever took. And when I was a student at the University of New Hampshire, I might have been a sophomore. I only went a year and a half there, but they were developing a new biology exam, and they were trying to recruit students from other disciplines, and I was kind of in psychology. So a whole class was asked to take this biology exam. And it turns out I got the highest score on the exam. The guy who was developing the disc came over and said, you know, you're the guy who got the high. And I said, but I'm not taking any biology courses. So that told me, you must be interested in this kind of stuff, because I read it when I was in the Air Force, flying on airplanes. I read about biology, etc. And I still read science from cover to cover, but mostly the biology stuff, genetic stuff. So I must have a experience-producing drive in that particular domain. But you really do have to focus to some extent. But once Nancy Siegel pushed me kind of over the cusp, I have now a whole bookcase full of books on evolution, evolutionary psychology, but I've always liked this. One thing I've always really aggravated me. I went to Catholic schools and I didn't learn anything about evolution. And I thought about that, and that really pisses me off when I think back about that. That's a very important intellectual topic, and people with religious biases really, I think, corrupt young minds by not teaching them some real things about the world.
Well, this has been very enjoyable. We've gone for an hour, and
I'm just getting warmed up.
Well, we're not going to stop now, but the audience has been promised that they get you for 30 minutes to ask you whatever they want. So I'd like to open this up for questions. Yeah.
Okay, you've done a tremendous amount to establish the heritability of intelligence, personality, a number of other things of that type. You more or less just nailed it down along with others. What's left out there to be done in that domain?
The question is, what's left to be done scientifically beyond the heritability of traits?
Well, it'd be nice to know what the environmental influences are. And I pointed out I have a particular theoretical point of view that it's just something about the way you put biological organisms together, otherwise they don't survive in an evolutionary sense. I'm not sure whether psychologists can tackle that problem or not. So that's an interesting question. Another very, very interesting question is the interface between the environment and the organism. What is that interface? I mean, Galton, pointed out that his critics said, well, it's all kind of complicated, but he was right. You can partition the variance in two ways and get estimates. But the fact is, genes alone are nothing but a damp spot on the floor. Genes have to express themselves. They have to basically engage in the creation of an organism. That organism has to survive in its environment. It has to transact with that environment. Notice I use the term transact, not interact, because interact implies something quite different. Mostly organisms transact with their environments. And how all that works is, I think, a fascinating problem. And of course, that's the problem of signaling systems between cells, signaling systems between neurons, etc. We know virtually nothing about that. We don't know how even the simplest organ systems are created. I think there's a guy giving a talk at the University of Minnesota over in the neuroscience department. Gave it this afternoon, in fact. How does Drosophila create the salivary gland? The salivary gland in Drosophila is a very important gland. Okay, they know a couple of signaling genes and a couple of instructions to work, but this kind of simple organ. We've got a few ideas. We know Hox genes create the order of vertebra and vertebrate animals, and the same genes actually work in Drosophila, but how you turn them on and off, how they know when to stop, those questions all apply to how you build brains. And the brains are what mediate behavior. So I tell my students, I can give you this stuff about 50% of the variance is genetic, 50% is environmental, but I can't tell you. There's major mysteries to be solved.
If I can just have a follow-up on that. Let's look now at genes. From Mendel on, we were able to make these kind of statistical predictions, and then Fisher made that even more precise. And we've had many fine talks today dealing with intelligence and factor analysis. And for those who have eyes to see, we can see that G predicts an awful lot in the real world. But how close are we to understanding what intelligence really is? In the case of genes, we didn't get it until Watson and Crick started playing with jigs and putting it together. Are we even close to that in intelligence?
Are we even close to understanding the underlying process?
I'm not sure that's the way one ought to pose the question. For example, like I remember walking by someplace in Florida the other day, and they said, it was a magazine that says, you know, are viruses alive? So you can really ask the question, what is life? Well, is that a real scientific problem, or is that just a kind of verbal problem? If we know how to build viruses, and we know how they work, and we know how they infect more complex organisms and kill them, what does it mean to ask, well, is the virus alive? Is the host alive? That's a semantic problem, in my opinion. And so in a sense, asking what is intelligence or what is personality, I'm not sure that's a scientific question. You get my, if I know all the consequences and I know how to put it together and take it apart, I know how it works. It seems to me the task of science is answer the question, how do things work? And if you can do that, so if you can say, here are genes, here's how they are expressed, here's how they build an organism, here's how a brain is built, here's how a brain transacts with the world, and here are the outcomes, behavioral and other, you've solved the scientific problem. The kind of question you're asking, I think, is more metaphysical. Now, I'm not a philosopher, so I may be just completely off base on that, but that's how I think about I think working scientists think about these things a little differently than philosophers and reporters.
Buzz?
I'd like to follow up on that for just a minute. Tom, I gather from what you're saying that you would regard what is intelligence at the brain molecular level as not being a scientific question, but that you would regard the question.
No, why not?
That what is intelligence wouldn't, but that you would be quite happy with the scientific question of what is the mechanism for control of attention.
Absolutely.
Or what is the mechanism for holding information in working memory?
Yes, yes. What are the brain circuits? And then intelligence is, we get a measure we call intelligence because of the functioning of those mechanisms. And so I'm a mechanist, I'm a reductionist at heart. There's just no question about it. And I think you do science piece by piece. You try to run as many comparisons as possible. I really hate the constant just one control group. Actually, we always have more than one hypothesis about things. And if we had more than one kind of control or comparison, we'd probably learn more in every single experiment. So I think we kind of do some of this stuff wrong. But yeah, I'm a mechanist. What are the mechanisms? What are the mechanisms? And then I think if you can tell what the mechanism is, you know what's going on. Putting it in what is intelligence is a little, it's not answerable from my frame of reference.
Art?
You're thinking of the mechanism of reduction as physiological, chemical sense, not in terms of mentalistic concepts.
No, I think every mentalistic concept is encoded in the brain. It's like there was an interesting story in Time magazine recently about the God gene, etc. And my colleague Lyndon Eaves was asked a question. Some neuroscientist said, well, God is in the brain. And the reporter said to Lyndon, well, what do you think about that? And he said, of course it's in the brain. It's not in the big toe. I mean, mentalistic concepts have to be in the brain. Otherwise, you have to be a dualist and say, well, there's two spheres, and I'm not a dualist, I'm a reductionist. Not that philosophers, a lot of philosophers argue that that's not possible. I mean, that argument has been made. And sure, it may be there are fundamental limits to what human organisms can know. I mean, that's not impossible. That's a Kantian argument, that there's a limit. But I think we're going to get much further by studying the brain I think there's a limit to what you can do with behavior genetics. I think what we've done in behavior genetics is point out what biological organisms were created by genes. They're terribly important. We've got to understand how the whole system works. And, you know, there are genes, brains, and behavior. And the linkages are unknown, almost. I tell my students, this is a fascinating time to be a scientist. There are just all kinds of fascinating questions that we have the vaguest answer to. This is in contrast with John Horgan, who said the end of science, you know. God.
The heritability analyses that you do partition behaviour into things that are due to additive genes and shared environment and unique environment. What if you could comment on what surprises people when they look at the outcomes of those studies that indicate that even though we all believe the family is important, and we've just heard you for the last hour talking about the critical elements of your environment, why C is 0 and what's in E, and what explains why people think that C should be greater than 0?
Well,
Dave, repeat the question.
When you partition variance, what explains that C should be 0?
Well, actually, it's an empirical matter as to whether C is going to be 0 or not. And in fact, there are domains where C is not 0. So that proves that the methods will detect it if it's an important component. But what you have to remember is variance analysis doesn't deal with means. It deals with variances. So if I took everybody here, let's go back to when you were born, and we put you in the Pleistocene, and you don't go to school, et cetera, but somebody develops IQ tests, I don't think any of your IQs are going to be anywhere near where they are today. So we're ignoring the main effect of the environment. We're only looking at variance. And so I think people are making that confusion. They say, oh, my mother provided me with food. I mean, if you didn't eat, you wouldn't grow. And if we didn't die, we'd be stunted if we were starving. So we certainly need adequate environment to express our genotypes. Our genotypes have developed to be expressed in what's called the average expected environment. That's how evolution works. And if the environment gets too hot, our brains burn up and we die. If the environment gets too cold, we freeze. We can exist within only a particular range of environment. And our genotypes are suited to those environments. But they have to be there. They have to be good enough. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Nate?
Tom, I'd like to ask a follow-up on that. That David Rowe and Turkheimer, among others, have argued that C is higher and that heritability is lower for things like intelligence, for individuals who are reared in families whose parents have had very little formal education. What's your take on that?
Yeah,
I your twin stuff.
It's perfectly possible. Turkheimer and Gottesman and Donofrio have a nice paper on that. That particular paper completely confounds race and social class, however. That's a completely confounded paper. I mean, Herb's a good friend. My wife and his wife play golf together. I mean, but I tell him I would not have published that paper, and I wouldn't have accepted it if I'd have been a reviewer. So that's a complete confound. But it's perfectly plausible, and I think people ought to do the studies. There's no
You
question
have,
about it.
you have the same feeling about Rowe's data on the reanalysis of the national longitudinal.
Yeah, but their samples are funny. You know, they weren't able to, I mean, they're estimating what the relationships are, et cetera. So again, it's not, you know, and it's a study that could be done. And somebody must be doing it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're doing it, probably the TED study would be able to answer that question, yeah. I'm gonna go with the data. Let's do it. I'm perfectly happy to do it. And there's no question. I tell my students, look, heritability doesn't tell you anything about immutability. I said, I take a little infant, I bang him on the head enough, I'm going to cause brain damage, he's going to have a low IQ. We don't have to do studies of that. So our questions about heritability really ought to be focused on a reasonable range of environments. We ought to be able to talk about it that way. But people who criticize behavior genetics are kind of saying, well, you know what happens if, you know, you grow up in a barrel? They'll have an argument. Yeah. Well, we know if you grow up in a barrel, first, nobody's going to be able to feed you. You're not going to be able to read. You're going to have a very low IQ if you survive. But that's like saying, well, what would happen if you grew up in the center of the sun? You know, nobody would. So what we have to do is get some sense of what's a reasonable range of environments to talk about. And then that answers the question. I know no behavior geneticist says all kinds of trauma will have no effect. No, trauma will have effects. There's no doubt about that. So extreme environments, by definition, we just know. We don't have to do experiments. And but the correlational data and quantitative genetics gives us a lot of information that molecular genetics doesn't. Quantitative genetics tells us why relatives are similar and why relatives are different. And it gives us nice models of how evolution works. Just pure molecular genetics saying, well, they got this gene there, and you see. The genes are transferred from parents to offspring, to siblings, etc. And explaining those relationships is an important scientific problem. Quantitative genetics does that. And it's anticipated in molecular genetics and all kinds of things. It's a very, very powerful theory. But it's a theory, and it's not fully developed. It has areas that could be better developed. But I don't think molecular genetics will ever, actually to answer Frank's question more, you know, the genetic correlation between all kinds of traits is unknown. One of the things we've just done some big modeling and have a theory of intelligence. We're now in the process of, if I can convince Wendy to do the work, we're going to do the same with personality. Then we're going to do the same with vocational interests. And then we're going to do the same with attitudes. And then we can ask, what are the covariances among all of these things? And what are the genetic covariances and the environmental covariances? Now, we don't have a big enough sample to really do it, but technically that's what a quantitative behavior geneticist would do with the domain of individual differences. They take what are the major theories and the major constructs at all levels across these domains, and then how are they interrelated? Is our vocational interest really completely different from personality and ability? And where they're not, where they're correlated, are those correlations due to genetic factors, the way the brain is put together, or are they due to environmental experiences, etc.? We don't have much knowledge about that.
Art?
You believe that the within-family component of environment is a largely random affair, or do you think that it can be analyzed systematically? What does it consist of? What's your best take on what the within-family environment consists of?
What is your best take on what the within-family environment is?
Well, in theory, it seems to me one could analyze it. If you could watch what every mother and every father and every sibling did, what the interactions are, and then did this for huge samples, you might get something systematic out of the data. But you might not. So I don't know the answer, but it would be a horrendously difficult undertaking, and I'm not sure it's worth it. I think, it does tend to approximate randomness. I think parents have all kinds of things they have to worry about, and that they pay attention to their children, but they're not, in most instances, trying to do anything systematic. They're trying to keep the kid alive, they're trying to keep the kid fed, they're trying to keep the kid clean, and that's why most of the relationship we see is genetic, not environmental, because so many other things are taking place, important things. We tend to think, well, the shaping of kids' personality or their vocational interests are terribly important. No, keeping them alive, keeping them fed, keeping them safe, keeping them clean. And to bring Judith Harris in, trying to influence them in terms of what other kids they play with is fundamentally important. Parents actually are very, very concerned with this. Who your friends are. You know, I don't like that friend. I'm surprised there's not a lot more focus on that. And in fact, Judith Harris, I think, correctly pointed out, peers have enormous influence on kids. And we don't have a good theoretical frame of reference for analyzing that. There are a few developmental psychologists who work with peer relations, but within the context of behavior genetics, that's another area that we could branch out to. So I do think there's a lot of kind of randomness. Whatever has to be done at any given moment is what a mother does or a father does, or actually a sibling does. So I don't believe there's a lot of systematicity in there.
Parents do move, though. I mean, I remember you telling me once one of the reasons you moved from California was because the kids were young and the drug culture, and parents moved to
you seek out a
better
different niche.
schools and stuff.
Sure, and but that doesn't get captured well because you spend part-time here, part-time there, etc. There's a place where you have deficiencies in the model, actually. And you could build that kind of thing into a model if you had a huge enough population that could get that built. But you know, we cut things at very crude levels. For example, we were reading a paper in a seminar the other day, Mapping Youth seminar, in fact, about how mobility was a bad thing. These were studies of lower class families, and they were saying the families that had to move were suffering. The kids were suffering more behavioral problems. The parents had problems, and they were arguing moves are not a good thing. They're hard on people. On the other hand, when I was a student at Berkeley, Don McKinnon was studying creative architects, and one of the most salient things that jumped out of that data was the most creative architects had actually moved. Their families had moved many times, and they had a greater diversity of experiences. So here in this frame of reference, lots of different exposure was a positive kind of thing in this other context. So I use this as an example in my classes. What you're really after is an underlying construct, not moving. There's the construct in the architects was greater and greater exposure to the environment, and you didn't want to just get it by moving, you wanted to get it in other ways. And for people in a very, very poor environment, moving is not a matter. What's going on probably is the kids are causing difficulty, the mother's causing difficulty, and the landlord's kicking them out. And so they're creating means a totally different thing. So a particular indicator is worthless. What an indicator has got to do is be linked to a construct, and then you've got to have multiple indicators. So we have to create proper constructs, and I don't think we even have any idea what the constructs ought to be for within family variants. Actually, there are probably a good number of them, but my gut feeling is it's just a lot of randomness.
One more question?
I guess I tired everybody out.
Tired them all out. Well, Tom, this was fun. Thank you.